Sat Ranjeev is the VP of Engineering at Solaris in Berlin. Now, what was so good about this episode was that we got to find out about the person behind the profile. From looking at Sat's LinkedIn profile, you'll see that he's accomplished a lot in his career and risen the ranks. But what was great is that we dug into the early days and we found out what it really takes to have a successful technical career. From there, we also dig into some technical wisdom around leadership, people, and he shares his advice for any aspiring engineers and engineering leads out there. An incredibly smart guy, a ferocious work ethic, and I really enjoyed picking his brains for an hour or so. So, without further ado, I'm Alex Boycey, and this is the Building Our World podcast. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on this warm Berlin evening. I wanted to just start off by winding back the clock to way back in the day. So you're at university, you studied statistics. How did you first sort of learn to code and then break into the career of software engineering?
Alex, thanks. It's really great to be on the show as well. I did do statistics. I did my master's in statistics, but then I started coding way ahead of that.
Oh, okay.
I think I was very lucky. I think luck has to play a big factor in a lot of people's life, which it has played definitely in mine, right? So I was actually quite lucky to be in a place where I was always surrounded by computers. My dad was a principal of a school. So I'm basically from India.
Yeah.
I'm from the southern part of India, a state called Kerala, but we kind of moved around in the southern states. And my dad being a principal, we used to live around the campuses of the school. And I had to wait for my dad to take me back home, and I would linger around in computer labs. And that's how I got hooked into computers. But officially, I learned how to program when I was in grade 4. We learned a programming language called Logo. It's a fun little language. I think it's a great introductory language for anybody who's starting to learn to code. It's
So
a small
how old are you in grade 4? How old?
grade 4. That would be 9-ish or something.
Really? God.
Yeah, something like
That's
that. I think so. 9
so
or 10, maybe around that.
so good they got you to do that so early on, because IT in England, it was honestly awful. It was how to make a PowerPoint presentation, a bit of Excel, and that was your lot. So how did you learn?
I think a lot of things changed over the years. So I probably did my this was probably around the 80s when I started working on it, right? So computers were very different those days. And I was having this conversation with another person where we're talking about when we started working in computers, it was all about coding. It was all about trying to get the computers to do something. Nowadays, I mean, I have a daughter who's 5 years old, and it's more about consumption, right? It's less about the creativity, but more about consumption. I think there's a slight shift in that, and or maybe a little bit more into design and things like. It's just become another medium to express yourself. While in the early days, it was this fascinating contraption where you wanted to break and see what works and what doesn't, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting and actually so true. And I suppose we're paying the price now because there aren't enough people now that can code. I think there was a push, especially in the UK, to start bringing coding into IT lessons, but it will just take a long time. So that's so interesting how it was when computers first started, the default was to teach kids how to make them run.
Exactly, right. And it was a fun little language, right? So it had a small triangle on the screen, and you had to tell it, if you wanted to draw a house, you would have to tell it, okay, move 10 steps forward, and then it would draw a line 10 steps up.
Okay.
And then you could draw a square, you could draw triangles. And then it became more complex when you had to draw a circle and things like that. So you could even draw a car if you wanted by just instructing the computer to do something. I think though nowadays you do have some interesting things, like they have these small robots it's like a car which you can tell, okay, move if you want it to move in a direction. So you can teach kids to say, okay, press this button 4 times, it would move all the way there.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. And then when you were progressing then through your schooling and university, I'm guessing at the same time, obviously, computers were slowly advancing as well. So,
Yeah, absolutely right. Like, I mean, after that, I got into writing things in BASIC. This used to be a very good language in those days. A lot of things used to be written
things have
there.
changed.
Things have changed definitely. I think a lot of the go-tos harmful comes from the era of BASIC.
Mm,
Then I've moved into writing some things in C and C++.
mm.
But then I didn't like C++ in the very early days, and I still don't like it. I know a lot of people will not like me here, like hearing that, right? But I still think it's a very confusing language. But I of course, did C++. And in India, at that particular point of time, everybody was moving into software. Um, and I just didn't want to do anything related to software at that point of time. And there were only two things that I was very interested in. One was computers, and the other one was mathematics. I had brilliant teachers. I think a big part of how you evolve as a person is founded on the teachers, right? So I had a brilliant teacher who used to be an aeronautical engineer, and then she decided to become a school teacher. So she was my
Yeah.
mathematics teacher, and she was fantastic. So I got into computers a little bit more and into mathematics because of her. And so when I wanted to decide, okay, what do I do next after high school, I decided that statistics would be a very interesting choice because it had all of the mathematics, but you didn't need to pick up allied subjects like chemistry or something
Yeah.
else, but it was purely mathematics and statistics and computers.
Mm.
And that's how I got into statistics, but while still being
Yeah.
slightly close into computers.
So was
But
that the days of like SPSS? Is that right? Was that?
yes, exactly. It
Yeah.
was the days of SPSS. And
Yeah.
yeah. Did you do mathematics, by the way, or
No, no,
statistics?
no. So, funnily enough, I remember it because my mum, growing up, did a PhD,
Uh,
and she had to do some data stuff, like a small part. And I
mhm.
remember these SPSS books around the house, so that's why I have a weird
So,
memory of it. I know now it's like Python and R, but yeah, it's
yeah, no, absolutely, that is true. And I remember having this discussion with my professors. I had just joined into the university. So I'm looking at languages that was, I think Python was probably there, and I was talking to my professor. We were using something called Fox Pro, and then we were obviously using SPSS as well. And I was saying, why don't we use proper programming languages to actually help us do things? And then, of course, professors being professors, they had their own historical context and biases.
yeah,
Um, but I did learn some really weird languages like Fox Pro and COBOL. I think
COBOL. Yeah,
yeah.
I
So
used to
yeah,
see that.
it was a fun few years university. I think one thing that came out interesting was Automata, and it was basically talking about languages, right, and how languages are formed, and this has definitely stuck on for a long time. Um, yeah, but I think more interesting is how did I shift from mathematics or
Mm,
statistics to computer science, right? Like, and this was a time when people were building a lot of websites, web applications, and my dad was then working in Bangkok as again a principal of one of the schools, and his friend needed a website to be built for his business. It was some small car leasing company, and so I decided to write something in Perl, and I just put it up over there, and this just kind of drew me again into, oh wow, I can actually build things, right? I can
mm,
build something, and I can write a few HTML pages, see that it is rendered. This was the early days of, I don't know if you know about LAMP. That was Linux, Apache, MySQL, Perl, PHP sort of thing.
mm.
So they would combine all of these things together, and Apache as a web server was a very, very big thing those days. So this is that's how I got introduced into all of the web development, web programming, and this was also a segue for me to get back into development. I
Hmm.
remember at that point of time, I started using Linux, or I got introduced to Linux, and I think that was also a big, uh, a changing point, right? A moment of time where I realized, okay, I am quite passionate about computers, and maybe I should just dig a bit deeper into that. And when I got introduced to Linux, I realized how much more was there to explore. I started crashing multiple systems all through my life. There would be a home computer which I would have probably crashed it several times, reinstalled Windows. I had a Windows machine, and then later we were lucky to get a Apple Mac, one of those translucent computers, right? I
Yeah.
forget which one it was, but I wanted to play games, and it wouldn't run on my really poor hardware. So I would try to compress it. I would try to flip things in the hardware to try to see if it actually worked, and it did. So that's how I used to break things around trying to figure out how it could possibly work. And so also moving into the web development also was something similar like that. I wanted to see if I could build something on the web, right? I would see a lot of websites, so I tried to figure out, how do I actually learn, how do I build something that could be useful. I remember using something called as Adobe Macromedia, which was some sort of a application where you could build websites, but they were actually images, but not HTML content. So it looked beautiful, but it was just horrible to render. I realized that was a terrible way to do it. Moved into HTML. Then, of course, you wanted to figure out how do you submit some forms. Then you learn, okay, there's something called as a CGI language, something like Perl. And then I started doing that. And so
Hmm.
that's how I got into web development. And in the meantime, I was also sitting down learning more about Linux, how to run Linux systems. I did a course on Red Hat systems, basically how to manage and maintain servers. And another opportunity knocked my door. One of my whole family is into education. So I have my brother who's right now a principal of a school. I have my
Oh, okay.
sister-in-law who's also a teacher. I have aunts and uncles who have been professors and also. So there was another. So my sister-in-law's school was trying to print report cards for using Excel, and they had about 400 kids or something, and so they were trying to print report cards from this, and then they were setting up a new campus. So sharing these files was super difficult, and they would have problems. It would take days for them to bring all these things together and print it out. And this was my first proper job into development. So I
Hmm.
went there. I told them, okay, I'll help you build your own, school management system. And I wasn't aware that there were actually great tools over there. I just told them, okay, you have a shitty Excel process. Let me make it simpler for you. I hoped to make it simpler.
Hmm.
And then one thing led to another. I built an entire application first in Perl that crashed. Then I moved to PHP. That was terrible. And then I moved into Python and settled down in Python.
Hmm.
And it was basically to manage the different scoring mechanisms, the different kids that were there in multiple locations. We built our own servers, we built the networks, and slowly started, building
Yeah.
my own team around it.
Yeah. But how did you know how to do all this? Because you say you sort of jumped in,
Mhm.
oh, yeah, I'll build this for you, no problem at all, using all these different languages. Um, that's not, I don't think, it's a normal sort of thing to do. So where did
Uh,
that come from?
Good question, right? I think so. I had the fundamentals right. I had a good, strong foundation in logic. Like I knew that, okay, if you wanted to get something done in computers, you had instructions, which would actually then perform actions, and then you could see this coming out, right? Uh, but then there was a lot of information on the internet, right? I think those early days, there was a lot of documentation, which helped a lot. There were quite a lot of books as well. I read a lot of books actually. I like usually I have about two or three books that I read simultaneously, and this has been a habit
Okay.
that's going on, and I spent a lot of time reading books about Perl. Perl, actually, the language, has a wonderful book written by the person, the creator of Perl. I think it's Larry Wall. It was a very interesting book. So I read that book. That kind of helped me understand. There was another book about writing web applications that also helped me. And it was the early days of the internet, not very early days of the internet, but at least, not now. It was in 2000s. So there was a lot of people on forums, on IRC, who would actually help out, right? So these definitely helped me understand things, and it was a lot about trial and error. I think I would have. I used. I mean, those were very early days, so I would spend hours and hours in front of the laptop trying to figure things out. My friends didn't understand what I was doing, but when they saw the outcome, they probably kind of figured it out. But it was a lot of time spent in front of the computer trying to solve things out, and so it was. I would say a lot about trial and error, a lot about reading, and a lot of great people on the internet who would help. There were a lot of rude people as well, but I think that
There
also
always is
helped,
on the
right?
internet. There always is. But that's so refreshing to hear, like, because you see now, like, if anyone looks at Sat's LinkedIn profile listening, like, you see VP of engineering, worked your way up the tech space. And I think what is annoying now in the tech space, you sometimes get is like software engineering is almost like sold as the dream. It's your get rich quick, learn this in 12 weeks and you'll get a 50, 60K a year job. But every sort of successful person I've spoken to in tech, and someone like yourself who has moved up, you were doing the hard yards back in the early 2000s, reading, obsessed with coding, really just in front of your computer. And I've never done software engineering, and I doubt I will, but I've spoken to literally thousands, and they all have that one thing in common. Every single one of them has grafted in front of a computer to make it happen.
Absolutely, right. I think you do need to put in the work, right? I think, of course, passion is there, but I think passion is also overrated. Unless you put in the work, it's not going to come out, right? So definitely lots of hours reading. I think it's a lot of things about a lot of failures, right? I'm sure I have crashed my computer several times. I installed Linux on my machine in somewhere in 2001 or 2002. It was the only computer we had at home, and I crashed the entire computer, and I didn't know what to do. And my dad was furious. He was like, "What did you do to the computer?" Right? And then it was trying to find out. So I had to go and reach out to another person who introduced me to Linux and told him, "Okay, I've really screwed up. Right? Help me out over here." So then he comes and helps me out. We reinstall it, get it working, and then I'm like, "Phew." No, so I think it's a lot about learning through mistakes as well. So that definitely helps.
It's that one thing that strikes at me about software engineering is the absolute patience, because it's frustrating enough when my computer crashes, but I haven't built a system in that computer, spent hours doing that. And I know on like a commercial level, when you're testing things and things break, or there's a bug or something crashes or there's an outage, that's something that's probably unique compared to other careers. I don't know how much of a trait that is needed of patience.
I think patience, absolutely, you definitely need, but then also you figure out through experience where to look when things crash, right? There was a famous, not a famous one, but there was an interesting conversation over email where somebody tried to send an email or try to connect something, and after, if he was trying to send it to somebody outside 500 kilometers, it wouldn't work, and before
Really?
500 kilometers it would work, and the person was stumped. And basically it was just that, the time that the message takes to send to the server, it was getting timed out, and then it would crash. And so this person tried to figure this out, and so only through experience would somebody be able to actually identify that it was timeouts, right? So of course, you're spot on, right? I think in the early days you definitely need to have a lot of patience, a lot of grit, like Angela Duckworth says, right? You need to persevere.
Yeah, it's a great book. Great book.
Oh,
Grit by
absolutely.
Angela Duckworth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry. So yeah, absolutely, right? Like you definitely need to persevere, right? You need to see that. Of course, it's going to break. Of course, it's going to crash. But they are very logical. Why is it crashing? What is wrong with it? Am I doing all the things that's necessary to get there? Right? Am I taking the right steps? Maybe I'm actually not. I haven't read the documentation correctly enough to actually have done it correctly. So that there's nothing magical in computers. I think that's the fun part, right? So it's always logical. You can actually figure out something is wrong. You just need
Mm.
time.
Mm. Okay, so when you obviously broke into software engineering, you had this sort of skill set behind you. So, how did the next steps of your
Mhm.
career pan out? How did you get your first few jobs in the field?
Yeah, I think the next job was the most interesting job in terms of as a software engineer. So since I had a background in statistics and I had been working in Python for a long time, I think one of the things that was quite influential for my next job was I started writing a lot. I had a blog. It was in WordPress in those early days, and I used to write about everything that I had learned. It was just basically trying to keep a record of all the things that I had done. And somebody on the internet found out about my, writings on Python, and also figured out that I had done my, I had a background in statistics, and they were trying to create a team in India, uh, which was going to work on a system building handwriting recognition software. And so we started talking about what would be the next, how do we get this moving forward? We had a couple of interviews, and then I got the job. And so I went to as one of the early engineers in that company. And I think this was a turning point, because then this moved from building software for other people, small companies, not small school, it was quite a large school, but still it was specifically built for a need, right? Or for a particular problem, a smaller scale problem. While the one that I took up was actually, we were trying to convert handwritten insurance forms or bank opening forms, all these, we wanted to convert them into digitized format. We wanted to use OCR or ICR to actually do this. And of course, my background in statistics and Python helped out a lot. I started building stuff. And this was also a place where I got quite close to management. And over the years as well, the previous one, I built a team about 3 people. Over here, when I joined as one of the early engineers. Then we grew the team. I became a tech lead, and we grew the team to multiple teams. So I became an engineering lead or a manager.
Mm.
And we had 3 teams at some point of time. JavaScript also kind of came into the picture. I spent a lot of time optimizing things. I remember there was this one algorithm which was very, very slow in Python. And so I had to write it in C, and that actually improved the speed a lot,
Really?
significantly. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, some things, of course, I mean, it's not just the language. There was also a lot about the data structures. There was a lot about how we utilize the algorithm, and the algorithm also kind of shifted a bit. So all of those definitely helped.
Mm.
But also this way, I spent a lot of time in optimizing. But slowly, I started moving into a leadership position.
Okay. Because yeah, I wanted to pick up on that because part of the reason I wanted to get you on, obviously, you are a seasoned engineering leader. You've done pretty much all the positions going. Um, I actually did a post on LinkedIn today, and maybe listeners of the podcast would have seen it or will remember it now. But it was basically saying, so I speak to software engineers all the time who I've basically been in the game for say like 10 years or maybe even more, and they feel like they've done and achieved everything they can technically. They lead technically, they maybe mentor, but they haven't taken that jump to like people management. And the reason is that they don't want to take on these new responsibilities at the expense of the technical side. So
Mm-hmm.
my question was to sort of my network today, can you add these people management responsibilities without completely sort of sidelining the technical stuff that you've done and worked for all these years? Because I do speak to engineering leads that have done it and want to reclaim their technical expertise because they're not showing it anymore. But what's your view on that?
Yeah. So it's interesting question at the right time, because when I moved into engineering leadership in this company, after 3.5 or nearly 4 years, I said I had enough of leading people. I can't do it anymore. I want to get back into software development. So I moved in as a software engineer again. And then when I joined SolarisBank is when I started taking up leadership positions again. For those who, so the question was, can you keep on to the technical leadership while leading people? I think it depends on the scope of your, the leadership role that you're taking up, right? If you're a technical leader, like a staff engineer or tech leads in other companies, I think it's definitely possible. And this would be something that you are required to do, right? I was required to understand and lead the architecture, or let's say own the architecture of the systems when I was a technical lead, while also think about how the team works, how the team is performing, are we working well as a team, all of that, the cohesion of the team, right? So
Yeah.
I think in terms of that scope, that would be a sweet spot between leading people, not necessarily thinking about their people skills, their growth, but more about the team cohesion. And you are very close technically.
Yeah, but I think a lot of companies don't really do that. They lump both things together, and all of a sudden you're a seasoned engineer, but you're having one-on-ones, you're hiring, you're firing,
That's right.
you've got to have a conversation with HR. Your calendar just gets blocked up and blocked up,
Yeah,
and that is something that can creep up very quickly from what I hear, especially in companies that grow quickly.
absolutely right. And I think that needs to be a conscious choice, because for me, it was not a conscious choice in the first time. It was more like I evolved into that role, right? Because of the need, I sort of took up a lot of the responsibilities, and I wasn't ready for it. And I think that's something that each individual will have in a different phase of their time. And of course, I think some companies we've done it so that technical people can have a very technical growth, that they don't need to take up people responsibilities. Like we have two tracks, one for engineering management, one for a technical, let's say an architect sort of kind of
Yeah.
position, right? So, and I think that's important as well. I think that helps people choose sides. But honestly, I would say a lot of engineers should try management, because when I used to be a software engineer, I would say, what the heck is my manager doing? Right? Like, I can't see what are all the things that the person is doing. But then there's a lot of things in the background where people don't realize, right? And as a software engineer, the let's say the vantage point is very different. So you see only a limited amount of problems that needs to be solved. As a people lead or a manager, you just now have a huge, huge set of problems that you need to keep an eye on. So definitely, it's worth giving it a shot if somebody's on the verge of thinking. Right, like I think it was Charity Majors, right? Fantastic blogger. So she also moved into management, and she writes a lot about people leadership. And so she says, it takes maybe about 2 years to lose the technical skill. So give it a shot for about a year or two and see whether you like it or not. And then if you don't like it, within 2 years, you need to make that call.
Oh, so it takes about 2 years. That's interesting.
I would, I mean, it's a hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
So because if you think about the software evolution, a lot of things definitely change within 2 years. So if you ask me, I still program, I still write code, but it's not the code that goes into production of Solaris Bank. For example, I've written my own software parser. It was a fun thing to do. I want to be, I want to be close to writing code, but not something that goes on production. But in the company, we use a lot of new technologies, a lot of paradigms which I'm not familiar with. There are a lot of tooling that I'm definitely not familiar with, right? So I think the tooling also evolves, and 2 years is quite a long span that you're away from then to catch up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does move so quickly. But you are now a VP of engineering. And yeah, there will be many engineers probably thinking, what the hell does a VP of engineering do all day? So please shed some light.
That's yeah, absolutely right. I had the same question as well, right? Like, what does a VP of engineering, or what does he do, or what does she do, right? There's a lot of things, and I think this is again my personal opinion. I think a VP of engineering having a very strong background in engineering definitely helps, right? So
Mm.
one of the key areas that we look into is to set the technical direction, right? And it's not technical direction of how the code should look or how should libraries work together or some things that needs to work together, but more in terms of what is a strategy that will make the company successful. For example, in SolarisBank, our strategy was to adopt what Amazon did with "you build it, you run it." So basically, taking ownership of having the software development ownership all the way from ideation to actually maintaining and running systems on production, right? So this is a software direction that you know somebody of a VP level would actually need to set. So
Yeah.
the technical area is definitely a big part of it. It's not as, and again, it differs from different companies, right? So you would have smaller companies where the VP is probably very involved in coding or reviews of something of that sort. While larger companies, of course, there's I haven't seen code. I mean, I occasionally look at pull requests just for the sake of it, but it's not a
Mm.
part of my responsibility, right? So, of course, the size of the company changes what the role has to do.
Mm.
The other things would be organizational problems or organizational topics, and I think this is something. There's this law called the Conway's law, which says that your software architecture reflects how your organization is formed. So if your organization is formed, if it is messy, then your software architecture is also messy. And if your organization is well defined, well structured, the architecture also eventually becomes better structured, right?
Mm.
It's not necessary, but definitely helps, right? So I think setting up an organization to um, to bring this clarity or to bring this um, soundness in architecture definitely helps, right? So
Yeah.
how do you split the teams? How do you define boundaries within the product groups that you have? Those would be also something that I would say is a big part of my responsibility.
Yeah.
Of course, then comes the people responsibility. I think that's probably the highest, I would say. My job is to make sure that I hire the right people, right from my own managers, right? So if I get the right managers, they would then get the right software engineers and so on and so forth, right? So hiring and setting up a culture for success, that would be, let's call it the topmost priority.
Mm. So you come on to that. So you are obviously above software engineering leads. Um, Obviously, I know a lot of leads. A lot of the hiring I do is engineering leads because I think it's the hardest role in tech. You have to have those hard tech skills and those people skills to coach and inspire. So, someone who's probably interviewed a fair few, what do you look for in an interview, and what do you think makes a great engineering lead?
I usually look for the three qualities that I just mentioned. One is the technical ability. I think in this world, in the software world, of course, there are leaders who don't have technical background or software development experience, but I definitely bias myself towards people with technical background. So software
Mm.
engineers. So having a sound background, especially in the field, in the area that you're developing. So we
That's
develop.
a bit. That's a bit of a. Some people disagree with that. I know.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. The reason I say is that, for example, we are building distributed web applications, or we're building web services and distributed systems. And if somebody doesn't have an experience or have a background in building web applications, building APIs, how is it going to be for this person to sit down and talk about the trade-offs that teams are making? And I think that's the key, right? To understand that teams are going to make trade-offs. Is this the right trade-off we need to do? Because as engineers, it's always fun to rewrite things. It's always fun to say, hey, that's a cool new technology. Let's do that, or let's do this. But it's always a trade-off between bringing value to the company and building X, Y, or Z, right? So unless there are people who don't have a background who excel at it, right? So I'm probably trying to say the simpler route is to go find the people who already have software engineering background, right? There would be exceptions to all rules, and they're great people who don't have background in software development who do great. But I usually prefer the ones with this background. So technical experience or technical understanding would be something that I would look for. And I would not look at details. I would look at rather problem-solving abilities, rather looking at how somebody able to actually understand the trade-offs that the team is working on. Like, for example, we process at a quite a huge scale of transactions, and so for your listeners, I work in a bank, not a typical bank. It's an API bank, so we basically sell APIs. So you can think of it as something akin to Stripe. Now, when we're building financial APIs, it needs to be scalable, it needs to be reliable, right? So both of them are important. And to do that, there's a lot of trade-offs that we are making. For example, some of our systems are eventually consistent, so that we can have the scale that we want. But that was a conscious choice that we made. And to have this understanding is very important if you're building systems of scale. And I think that probably would be the differentiation. I mean, that would be something that I would look for.
Yeah.
The next one is the people skills. As an engineering leader, it is very important to understand how people work. I think that it probably goes without saying that this person needs to be empathetic, right? To understand a lot of nuances that's there when dealing with people. Dealing with computers is very easy. You did this, you get that, right? If you don't do this, you get this. With people, that just blows up, right? There's so many factors involved. So having that understanding of people, understanding a bit about how people react to things, how to deal with hard situations, conflicts, all of this would be something that I would definitely look for. And experience matters here, unfortunately, right? So you don't need to have, I wouldn't look for somebody titled as an engineering manager or a team lead. I would question them. Tell me about an experience where you had to deal with a difficult situation within your team. What did you do? Right? How did you help solve that situation? What was your role? So even though you might have been a software engineer in a team, you could have been a people leader helping the team solve situations, right? So that's something that I look for.
Yeah, that's something I talk a lot about on this podcast is how do software engineers get that promotion to lead? Because it's so hard to get headhunted for a lead role if you haven't got that experience already. And stuff like that, when you are a software engineer, those extra bits. And then when the opportunity does come and you put your hand up, they go, well, yeah, you've shown it this time. And it's such a key.
You bring a very important point, right? I think people who want to move into leadership positions, I think it's good for them to start thinking about what are all the other things that they can do. For example, when I was a software engineer in a fintech in Germany, I was very involved in the hiring process. I set up the process of how we would hire engineers in that previous company. Regarding even to going to listing down the questions that we could possibly ask, what would be the setup for the interviews and all of these. This wasn't necessarily my job, but it was something that I found interesting, of course, right? But then this definitely helped explain to the next job that I wanted to take, right? So there are lots of opportunities. And I think, and of course, my manager was very helpful in showing me these different directions, these things that I could do, right? And it's definitely helpful to talk to your manager as well and say, hey, I want to move into leadership positions. Help me actually gain some experience. And
Yeah.
managers are usually very helpful, right? Like they look for ways to actually provide that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now I wanted,
Maybe
sorry.
one last point on this, on the
Yeah, go
engineering
ahead. Go
leadership,
ahead.
is the organizational ability.
Yeah.
I think when being a software engineer, the the problem solving is quite straightforward, not simple, straightforward. You would have a problem. There's a Jira board, there's a Trello board, whatever it is that's being used, right? You would pick up a task, you would try to solve it. With engineering management or engineering leadership, there is this, plus there's a lot of people problem, there's a lot of process problems, there's a lot of inter team problems, right? So having the idea of organizing all of these things, prioritizing which comes first, right? Which should be the thing that needs to be solved first. I think that's also important. So that's something else that I would
Mm.
ask. So technical, people, and organizational, those would be three attributes that I look for.
Absolutely. And any engineers listening or engineering leads listening, I know would take a lot of value from that. Now, towards the end of every episode, usually I try to get to know the person I'm speaking to. So
Mhm.
we've discussed a lot about what you've done in your career and obviously your area of expertise. But with this podcast as well, it's the human stories behind human innovation. That's why I sort of started it. So now time for your cross examination. No, I'm only joking. But you've said a few things in this episode that have seemed interesting to me. So you sat and did the hard yards in front of a computer when you were younger. You started a blog that got you noticed. You say you read 3 books at once. These are kind of things that not the average person does. And I just wanted to try and find out, and I know it's so hard to say, but where do you think this drive and this energy to do stuff and to get through the work has come from?
Huh. Interesting question. Interesting because I haven't thought much about it.
No one ever
Um,
does. Yeah, it's a interesting one.
um, I think from very early on, I was taught to be curious by my dad. My dad was a tinker. He used to make aeroplanes, aero models. He used to, help us try out things, trying to, do things, and he definitely set an example to us, right, in towards what you could do. He basically stripped down his car and refixed it or built the entire car again. So all of these things, this is what I grew up with, seeing my dad do all of these things. I think that definitely sort of implanted something in me that I need to also start, being curious about things, being
Mm,
able to do things. And I would say definitely that is a source of the drive. Like I'm definitely curious about it. So with technology, that was something, right? So I wanted to know more about it. With people, that also was another thing. How do I solve? And the reason I read books is basically because I want to know more. I want to know what people are talking about. I want to
yeah.
know how other people solved it. So I think that's where the curiosity, probably that's where the drive is about.
Mm. Do you have any like reading hacks? Why do you
Oh
read?
yeah.
Why do you read 3 at once?
Oh, yeah, that's a good story actually. So I used to read a book at a time,
Yeah,
and
that's what I
so
do.
it would be a fiction or it would be non-fiction. And my dad was very particular that I finish the book. So in younger days,
Mm.
I come from a family of voracious readers, so I think that helps as well. But so he was very particular that we finish the book, and I used to take a long time to finish the book. I would just chug along. But some books that I didn't like, I would just chug. It would be just I couldn't keep the book because I hadn't finished it. One day I was like, okay, I was reading this very difficult book and I just couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't finish it. And so I picked up another book and said, okay, I'm going to just start reading it. And then this sort of, realization occurred that there are different moods of the day. You might have had a really tough day and you want to read something light. Or you might be very curious in the morning, or if you're a morning person, or when you have time, and then you want to read something that is difficult to understand and process. So this got me to actually pick up more books, and slowly, eventually, like 3 to 5 books is what I usually read. I have a couple of fiction books and I have a couple of non-fiction books that with fiction, I read page cover to cover. It makes more sense. There's a lot of interesting things. With non-fiction, I think if you look into the internet about not speed reading, but how to read it quickly, they suggest that you skim through the entire book once, look at the chapters, what people are talking about, then look at the chapters that is interesting to you, read that, flip around, take down a lot of notes, make the book your own. So scribble, write, make that conversation with the person. Don't read the entire book. Non-fictions. I don't think there are some books that I'm very, very engrossed and I finish cover to cover, but there are lots of books I would just skim through, skip. If I know this, if I understand this, I just skim through. At the end of the day, I want to get the gist, and I want to get something out of it. So
that's my issue though, because I say if I'm really struggling with a book, I'll almost feel guilty if I don't read the whole thing and try and take it in or take notes on everything. So when I read, I just try and jot down bullet points in my phone in the notes section. But I need to. I don't know why. I think it's a weird thing of almost I still have this weird thing that if I'm not suffering sometimes, then I'm not working hard enough, which I'm slowly maturing out of. Because back in the day, I would just used to do hard things for the sake of it, which isn't really sustainable. But I think I need to take a leaf out of your book.
Yeah. Literally, I think also focus comes into play. I moved away from ebooks to physical books. I have a couple of physical books, and I think that was also definitely helpful. It's also a little bit bulky, unfortunately, but making it your own sort of. I don't know about you, but back in the days in school, we were told not to write on books. And I had this for a long time that I wouldn't scribble anything, keep it very, very crisp and nice. But over the years, that's also changed.
Yeah. Well, I think that they say writing stuff down in hand is a great way to remember it. The brain seems to remember it even more than typing.
Absolutely.
Which is super interesting. For any sort of managers or even stuff around mindset, I know we mentioned Grit already by Angela Duckworth, which was one of the first sort of books I read when I started my recruitment career. But did you have any book recommendations for people out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. For people leaders, I would definitely recommend picking up a couple of the HBR, Harvard Business Review books. They have all these short snippets, right? If you're getting into management, this is a very good way to, read about a lot of the about management books, about management, right? In general, or leadership. They have some the 10 best reads or something like that, right? So that's a very good series to pick up. I would say spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time reading behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, right? So maybe all of those, right? I mean, Grit definitely is one. I would also recommend Freakonomics to understand behavioral economics in the beginning, right? There are books by. I'm losing the name of the books right now. I usually used to have my shelf of books behind the desk, but now I don't. We moved houses. I would say.
Have you ever read Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck?
No, I haven't.
Very, very good book.
But I do know the research and the theory behind it, right? So it would be good.
I'd recommend. I mean, I don't know how many young people listen to this, but I read that when I was 21, 22. Okay. And I kind of viewed things in a different way about how you can really learn, and it's almost liberating that you don't have sort of fixed talents. So I think when you're at school, there's that person who's good at maths, there's that person who's amazing at English or football or
That's right.
sport. And I think when I read that, it just sort of liberates you to know that you can learn stuff, you can get better at stuff, even if you're really shit at the beginning. If you do it more,
Absolutely.
you will actually get better.
Yeah. I mean, in these days, I would say there's this book called Leadership in Troublesome Times. That's a good book right now, given all of the situation that we've been in, right? I mean, a couple of other things, like the culture map is something that people talk about. A lot of my advice would be there's some things by Peter Drucker, which is also really nice.
Yeah.
But my advice would be a lot of the management books are very anecdotal, right? So some of them work, some of them don't work. And not to go by the book, like there's Five Dysfunctions of a Team, books like these, right? It's great. There's also there's some Peopleware that's also there. So a couple of books like these, they're great to read, but I think it's important also to understand that they are anecdotal and trying to see how this would actually work for you. Oh, there's a brilliant book by Eric Schmidt's How Google Works. I really like that because that's how Google set up their organization. Then, of course, not every company is Google. My company is not as big as Google, absolutely not. But there were lots of lessons from there that would help a lot. I think quite a lot. Like since they are
Would you
going to
say that
be
would help an engineering manager specifically?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. This is
Okay.
where he talks about hiring. There's also Work Rules by Laszlo Bock. He was the VP of HR in Google. He talks a lot about hiring. So these kind of things definitely help um, people who are moving into management and also seasoned managers, right? I like back to my caution, right? Like all these books, take it with a caution because those were experiences that worked. There's a lot of luck involved in a lot of people, right? So that is never factored into the books. So I think that needs to, you need to think about that while reading these.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And finally, you've done a lot, achieved a lot, you do a lot, and you're still working your way up. What does the rest of your career look like in your eyes? So when that time comes where you run away into the sunset, what are you looking back on?
What would I look back on? I mean, I think the most important, I mean, career is one, right? But I mean, as for a lack of better word, corny as it sounds, but family is the most important, right? Like when I look back, I definitely want to have spent quite a lot of time with my family. I have as I mentioned, a 5-year-old daughter. I
Yeah.
would want her to remember how I inspired her to be curious, or how I inspired her to do things, right? The same thing being with my wife, right? So I think that's definitely something that I would want to look back on. I would say, looking back, I would have wanted to be in a position where I had a lot of autonomy. I think this is something that has driven me to this position, and in a lot of jobs that I wanted to be, I wanted to have that autonomy to do things. So that definitely would be something, and also to have built something that was quite interesting, right? So the products that I've built, I'm quite happy about. I built an OCR system that was fun, that was challenging. I built a core banking system that had zero downtime when we migrated things out. So that was quite a big challenge. So I think the next thing should be something in that likes, right? Where I would feel like, okay, either the challenge part or the value part, right? Have I brought
Yeah.
value into this either this world or this industry?
That must be one of the great things about being in the engineering side of things. If you see an advert for something where you see someone use a piece of software and you think, oh yeah, I built that. I know how that works.
Exactly, right. Absolutely, absolutely. It
Yeah.
definitely gives it's not as much of a fun as actually holding on to something. Like if I was involved in the development of, I don't know, the first laptops or the iPhone or the Android devices, right? Like, that would have been fun because it's physical. But even software, when you see somebody use it, That's great.
Mm, no, absolutely. I mean, on a much smaller scale, I see it. If one of my clients has an advert on the TV, I'm like, that's my client. I work with them. Some engineers
Yeah,
done
absolutely.
all that, but it's a great way. And yeah, I mean, engineering. As I've said this to so many people, and they say it to me all the time. You have a chance with engineering to make a huge impact, to have
That's true.
to build something that maybe millions use, and a great sort of user experience.
That is absolutely true. I think, and it's so much simpler to actually bring value to people now than it was many years ago, right? The entry point is very low, honestly,
Yeah,
right? It's easy to get into it and easy to provide value.
absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time to end the show. So, but I mean, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really enjoyed that. You're, I mean, quite clearly, obviously, a smart person, but it's good to know the work and the story behind sort of just the job titles and things like that. And I know that will be valuable to a lot of people out there. So, thank you.
I do hope, and thanks, Alex. It was honestly a wonderful time. I enjoyed actually, having this conversation with you.
Good, good. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Building Our World podcast. Every view, stream, and download is massively appreciated. If you're new here, then please go back through the catalogue. There's some great gems from some of the brightest and the best in Berlin tech. And if you really like what you hear, then please do hit that follow and subscribe button. That's it for now, but until next time, goodbye.